They called her the quiet one. Just a nurse. The one with the slight limp and the trembling fingers that somehow never dropped a single full line in 3 years. Dr. Marcus Ashford watched her from the nursing station at 2:02 a.m., his expression unreadable, but inside his chest something had begun to shift, a low-pressure warning before a storm. He didn't know. Nobody at Seattle General knew. The sealed federal investigative file on his desk marked the incoming Marine Sergeant Major as something far bigger than routine post-surgical recovery. And the night nurse assigned to his care had just written 2 words in the patient's chart: Fallujah. The Major. What happened next would unravel everything Ashford had built, but first, he had to understand what he was looking at. He had no idea he was standing 3 feet away from the person who could destroy him. Margaret Walsh's scrubs whispered against her thighs as she moved through the ICU corridor at Seattle General's night shift, the fluorescent lights casting her shadow long and lean across the polished tile. Her left hand trembled slightly as she adjusted the 4 line on the patient in room 4, but the tremor came from the physical therapy exercises she'd done that morning, not from fear. Never from fear anymore. She'd learned to separate the two. The hand that shook was the hand that had been shattered by shrapnel in Ramadi 6 years ago, the hand that could no longer hold a surgical scalpel, but it could thread a needle, run and fork catheter with the precision of someone who'd practiced under fire. She breathed in the antiseptic smell mixing with stale coffee from the station, a smell that had become home when her actual home had become a grave. 3 years. That's how long she'd been rebuilding the lie. Night shift at a regional hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina. A nurse who kept her head down. A woman with a slight limp that nobody asked about. A jacket with a faded unit patch sewn into the lining that she kept in her locker, never wore, and certainly never mentioned. The break room was empty when she walked in at 0100 hours. Good. She poured black coffee into a mug that read Nurse Life and sat in the corner with a trauma journal, her way of being present without being present. 2 other nurses passed through, Cassidy and Morris, both nodded and kept walking. They'd learned not to sit with her. Margaret had perfected the art of existing in plain sight while remaining invisible. Her eyes tracked the emergency exit without thinking about it. Old habit. Every room, every corridor, every space had been mapped. 2 ways out of this break room. One through the main door, one through the supply closet and into the stairwell. That one was faster. She took a sip of coffee and turned a page in the journal, each movement deliberate and controlled. At 0200 hours, the admission alert came through. Room 7. Post-operative Marine Sergeant Major. Classified designation. Margaret's heart rate didn't change. Her breathing stayed level. But something in her spine straightened, and she closed the journal. The file had been flagged by Dr. Ashford himself, which meant it was serious. She'd learned to read the subtle tells of institutional power. Ashford wasn't a surgeon who got excited about routine cases. He was an administrator who'd climbed high enough to have secrets. Margaret pushed herself up from the chair with the controlled grace of someone who'd spent 2 decades moving through dangerous spaces, and her legs carried her to room 7. The sergeant major was unconscious, post-operative vitals stable. 63 years old. Tattoos on both forearms, faded Marine Corps insignia and something else, a date maybe. Margaret didn't ask questions. She checked his O2 saturation, 97%. His heart rate, steady at 68. His blood pressure, holding at 118/76. The chart was sparse. Surgery documented. Reason for admission blank. She adjusted his pillow and checked the foresight, no infiltration, clean placement. Her movements were economical, practiced. Like a dancer who'd learned the steps so well they became breathing. At 0400 hours, something shifted. The sergeant major's eyes opened. Not fully conscious, but surfacing from the sedation's depths. Margaret was beside him immediately, her hand on his shoulder, a light touch, enough to ground him. His lips moved. Words came out like gravel. Fallujah. Where's the major? Fallujah. Then he sank back down, back under the pharmaceutical darkness. Margaret's hand remained steady on his shoulder for 3 more seconds. Then she documented what she'd heard in his chart with clinical precision. Patient surfaced briefly at 0413 hours. Mumbled references to Fallujah. Mumbled reference to the major. Return to sedation. Vital stable throughout. She initialed it. Margaret W. Knight RN. And she didn't let herself think about what those words meant. The elevator doors opened at 0630 hours and Drive Ashford stepped out with the sealed folder under his arm. He was dressed too formally for this hour, pressed grey suit, Italian loafers, the kind of polish that came from money and power used as a second skin. He moved through the ICU like a man used to rooms shifting in his direction. Margaret was adjusting the ventilator settings when she noticed him stop at the nursing station. She didn't turn. She was good at not being seen. But she could feel his presence the way you feel a pressure change before a storm rolls in. Ashford pulled the chart for room 7 and opened it. She watched him from the corner of her eye, the way his jaw tightened when he read something, the way his hand went still when he got to her notes. Fallujah. The major. He read those 2 words 3 times. His face went pale. Not angry. Not confused. Pale in the way someone goes pale when they realize something catastrophic has shifted in their world. He looked up from the chart and scanned the ICU station. His eyes found Margaret adjusting the ventilator, her back to him, her movement steady and precise. He studied her for 7 seconds. The tremor in her left hand. The way she moved through space like she knew every exit route. The slight limp when she shifted her weight. Then he closed the chart and walked toward the administrative offices. Margaret didn't watch him go. She didn't need to. She already knew what was happening. Something was breaking. Something had already been broken, and he'd just found the fracture. Ashford's office was on the 3rd floor. Mahogany desk. Leather chair. Credentials framed on the walls, MBA from Northwestern, Hospital Administration Certificate from Johns Hopkins, photographs with the city mayor and state health officials. He sat down and opened his computer. The Marine Sergeant Major's federal file was still there, flagged for his eyes only. He read it again, word by word. Federal investigative case. Narcotics trafficking. Evidence of institutional corruption. And then he read the appendix, the list of people who'd accessed the file. Just him. And once, 2 years ago, the previous ICU director, Dr. Patricia Huang, right before she'd left to take a position at Duke. The phone was warm in his hand when he dialed. Not the hospital line. His personal line. The one connected to numbers that existed in a part of his life that didn't show up in the hospital's organizational chart. "We might have a problem," he said when someone answered. "With the night nurse on ICU 7. He paused, listening. "No. Not that kind of problem. The other kind. The kind that knows things." Another pause. His knuckles were white where he gripped the phone. "Yes. I'm certain. What do you want me to do?" He listened to the response, then nodded slowly, even though the person on the other end couldn't see him. "I understand. I'll handle it." He hung up the phone and sat in the silence of his office, the weight of that one decision settling onto his shoulders like armor that suddenly felt too heavy. He'd moved one piece on the board. Now everyone would move. But 3 floors below, in room 7, Margaret Walsh was adjusting the sergeant major's morphine drip, her trembling fingers steady as surgical steel, her heart rate exactly where it should be. She'd survived one war. She recognized when another one was beginning. The alarm that night wasn't a monitor flat line. It was the emergency exit door, hinges screaming as someone forced their way into the ICU at 0530. Margaret looked up from the sergeant major's chart, vital stable, sedation holding, no movement for 6 hours, and saw him. Lean, feverish, eyes like a shark in murky water. Hunting knife in his right hand, blade catching the fluorescent lights like they were meant to find it. He moved toward the medication cart with the jerky precision of someone running on adrenaline and whatever cocktail he'd already consumed. Fentanyl. His voice cracked on the second syllable. Give it. Now. Margaret rose. Slowly. Her movements the studied calm of someone who'd learned decades ago that speed telegraphs fear. The other two nurses froze, the student in turn pressed against the far wall, the charge nurse reaching for the panic button in slow motion. Margaret stepped directly in front of him, between his blade and the sergeant major's bed. She'd done this once before, in Ramadi, 2009, sandstorm weather the color of dried blood. The geometry of human shields hadn't changed. Sir, you need to put that down. The knife moved like it was attached to his spine instead of his arm. The first puncture was low, her left side, just above her ribs, a shocking cold that became heat in the space of a breath. The second came fast, angling up, her hand moving to press against the wound even as her body was still registering the first injury. Blood. Warm. Pooling on the linoleum tile like spilled antiseptic. Security arrived in pieces. One guard tackled him from behind. The knife clattered. The man screamed something about needing pain relief, the word pain repeating like a mantra as three officers subdued him, his elbow cracking against a monitor stand, someone shouting for codes, for police, for containment. Margaret kept her hand pressed against her wounds, applied pressure the way she'd been trained, the way her muscle memory recognized as non-negotiable. Her breath was steady. Her heartbeat was steady. The blood was not, but that was manageable information. 12 minutes later, a paramedic team rushed her to trauma. 14 stitches. 2 separate penetrating wounds. The left one had missed her spleen by the width of a fingernail. The right one had caught the fascia of her abdominal wall and stopped there, grateful for the intervention of connective tissue. 6 hours of observation. Standard protocol for stab wounds, check for compartment syndrome, bleed risk, infection markers. She sat on the hospital bed in her blood-stained scrubs and answered questions with the same steady voice she'd used during her military medical training. Yes, the wounds were clean. No, she hadn't felt dizzy. No, she wasn't experiencing sharp pain in unexpected locations. The physician assistant who sutured her up was a veteran, Fort Carson, 68th Combat Support Hospital, and he recognized something in her answers. The way she described her symptoms with clinical precision. The way she never once asked about pain medication. By 0800, the police report was being filed. Officer Chen, badge 4721, taking statements in the waiting area. The attacker, Marcus Webb, 28, outstanding warrant for burglary in Chapel Hill, history of opioid addiction that had stripped him down to the skeleton of a human being, was en route to county lockup. Straightforward case. Aggravated assault, hospital trespassing, attempted armed robbery of controlled substances. Open and shut. That's when Dr. Ashford arrived. He moved with the precise efficiency of someone expecting a routine administrative problem, the kind you documented and moved past. His tie was expensive, that kind of blue that wasn't quite navy, the kind that cost more because someone had decided to charge for subtlety. He scanned the incident report with the focused attention of a man trained to spot liability problems. Margaret watched him read her name. Watched his eyes move to her statement. Watched his jaw tighten when he got to the part about the sergeant major. You mentioned the patient vocalized, Ashford said. His voice was level. His eyes were not. During the incident. Earlier, Margaret said. He was sedated during the attack. But around 0200, he had a brief moment of consciousness. Movement. Words. What words? Margaret considered the question. Considered the way Ashford's entire body had stiffened, the way his professional mask had slipped for exactly 1 second, revealing something underneath that looked like recognition. Like fear. Fallujah, she said. And he said the major. That was all before the sedation took again. Ashford was quiet for long enough that the officer shifted his weight, suddenly aware that something unspoken had entered the conversation. Then the administrator forced a smile, the kind that moved his facial muscles but didn't reach his eyes, and said he'd review the security footage personally. Administrative protocol. Routine procedures. Nothing to concern anyone. But his hands gripped the incident report hard enough that his knuckles went white. He left with the file. 24 hours later, Margaret was released from observation and cleared to return to light duty. The sutures would hold. The wounds would heal. She walked back to the ICU at 14:30, her left side aching in the specific way that announced every movement, and found her name on the violation board in red marker, M. Walsh, protocol violation, engaged armed assailant instead of evacuation. Ashford was waiting in the sergeant major's room. The administrator stood by the window with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of someone conducting an execution with manners. The sergeant major's daughter was there, late 20s, military bearing that suggested blood came with a uniform, sitting beside her father's bed. She looked up when Margaret entered. Her eyes went to the gauze visible along Margaret's collarbone where the first wound had caught a section of exposed skin. "Ms. Walsh," Ashford said, and the formality was a blade in itself. "I'd like to discuss your judgment during yesterday's security incident." Margaret stood in the doorway. Her voice came out steady. "Of course, Doctor. Your training, your protocol, clearly states that when a security threat is identified, nursing staff should evacuate patients and surrounding areas. Instead, you engaged an armed assailant. You positioned yourself as a human barrier. This is not heroism, Ms. Walsh. This is cowboy mentality. The kind of action hero thinking that has no place in modern medicine." He let that hang. Let the daughter hear it. Let the words find their target. "Your job is to run," Ashford continued. "Let security handle threats. Your job is to be a nurse, not some." "I am a nurse," Margaret said. Her voice dropped an octave. One measured breath. Then, strange how my judgment was fine for 3 years until I worked one specific case. The words didn't crack. Didn't carry anger or defensiveness. They carried something else, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Ashford's face flushed. The daughter's eyes widened. The sergeant major, sedated as he was, lay between them like a question no one was asking aloud. "You're reassigned," Ashford said. "Effective immediately. Pediatrics. Your trauma might compromise ICU judgment." Margaret nodded. One tear escaped her eye, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the physical response of stitches pulling tight when her body wanted to move. She wiped it without breaking eye contact and left the room. Behind her, she heard the daughter ask her father's unconscious face, "What just happened?" The break room became a cold equation after that. Staff who'd shared lunches suddenly developed urgent tasks. Conversations died mid-sentence when she entered. By 1600, Margaret was eating in her car, a tuna sandwich, apple, the kind of meal that tasted like nothing because her body had redirected all attention to the fact that she was being systematically erased. Ashford had made calls. She could taste it in the silence of people who'd been instructed not to engage. Professional courtesy. Departmental unity. The practiced art of institutional exile. Her locker at 1700 was an ambush delivered with forms. Transfer papers. New assignment effective 72 hours. A rural clinic in a county 40 miles east, smaller hospital, budget constraints, departmental restructuring needs according to the memo stamped with Ashford's aggressive signature. The text beneath it read, "This reassignment is in the best interests of patient care and staff morale." Margaret folded her jacket carefully, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, Ramadi 2009 stitched in thread that had survived 3 years of washing and wearing, and placed it in her locker. She said nothing. She asked no questions. She simply accepted the box they gave her and filled it with the small pieces of a professional life she'd spent 3 years building in the shadows. "You mean my proximity to room 7 compromises something," she said, so quietly Ashford almost didn't hear it. The administrator looked at her, and something flickered across his face, not guilt, but close. A recognition that he'd been understood. That whatever was happening, whatever classified file he'd reviewed in the Sergeant Major's chart, Margaret Walsh had just told him she knew. The door closed behind her at 17:15. The next day, the official transfer orders came through. Rural clinic, 4 hours away, effective immediately. Ashford had expedited the process with telephone calls to administrators above his pay grade. Margaret was packing her apartment when the code blue alarm screamed through the hospital, 3 miles away, but the sound traveled through memory the way it always did. ICU 7. She knew it before she called the hospital switchboard. Knew it the way soldiers know the sound of incoming rounds, the way mothers know their children's cries in crowds. She called the ICU anyway. First-year resident named Chen, panicking about the Sergeant Major's oxygen sat dropping, about missing something during the day shift. Tension pneumothorax. Bleed that should have been caught, wasn't. The patient coding hard and the medical team circling in the way they did when protocols meant nothing and competence was something you either had or didn't. Her badge was gone. Her employment had 48 hours left before official termination. She wasn't cleared. She wasn't authorized. She wasn't supposed to have been anywhere near that hospital. She was in her car in 8 minutes. The parking lot at 21:15 was beginning to rain, soft at first, the kind of rain that announced itself as something temporary. Margaret knew it wasn't. Storms never were. She took the elevator to the 4th floor with her hospital badge long expired but her hands remembering the geometry of emergencies, and when she shouldered past the first-year resident into ICU 7, the room went dead silent. The Sergeant Major lay cyanotic, a heart monitor tracking the irregular rhythm of a body in crisis. His oxygen sat was 72% and dropping. The resident had already called for the crash cart, but his hands were frozen over the patient's chest, his mind running in circles because he wasn't trained for what came next. Margaret moved like her body was on automatic. No hesitation. No protocols. She reached into her personal bag, the one she'd carried home, the one she'd packed for her morning shift, and pulled out the MRE she kept there, a habit from deployment that had survived 3 years of civilian life. Meals, ready to eat. Field rations. Emergency supplies from a time when chest seals came from whatever was waterproof and flat and could be pressed against an open wound to restore the seal that kept lungs inflated. Needle decompression, she said. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. The resident moved. Training overrode the chaos. She tore open the MRE packaging, the vacuum seal hissed like escaping air, and created an improvised chest seal from the plastic sheeting, her hands moving with the muscle memory of 100 field interventions, of sandstorms and mortar fire, of a hospital in Ramadi that had held 43 lives together for 16 hours under siege. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. O2 climbing. 75, 82. 88, stable. 90 seconds. That was all the Sergeant Major needed. But Ashford was already there, already shouting about liability, about unauthorized patient contact, about how Margaret wasn't cleared, wasn't employed, wasn't authorized to do anything but leave. Security appeared at the door with the specific weight of someone who'd been called with explicit instructions. She was escorted from the building with her belongings in a box, her hospital badge confiscated, her employment status burning like a closing fist. The rain was falling hard by the time Margaret reached her car, the kind of rain that came from something ancient and unstoppable. She sat in the parking lot with her jacket on her lap, the one with its hidden patch, its buried history, and didn't move for a long time. The next morning brought a termination letter citing insubordination and unauthorized patient contact. She had saved him twice in 2 days. And nobody knew his name was the reason why. The break room smelled of burnt coffee and fluorescent hum when Margaret pushed through the double doors just after midnight. She'd finished her discharge paperwork, the ICU nurse station already transitioning to the next shift, and she needed exactly 6 minutes to decompress before driving home. The room had 3 other staff members scattered across worn vinyl chairs, Rodriguez from respiratory, Chen from lab services, and old Peterson who'd trained Margaret during her first month. She poured coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since afternoon. The pot was still warm, which meant someone had been here recently, refreshing it obsessively the way seasoned night shift nurses do. She settled into the corner chair, the one with the broken spring, and let her shoulders drop for the first time since the stabbing. Rodriguez's pager beeped. He stood immediately, not looking at her. Lab needs me upstairs. Chen's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, stood, and said something under her breath about the ED. Her footsteps moved quickly toward the hallway. Peterson sat motionless for 7 seconds. That was how long Margaret counted before he too found an urgent reason to leave, mumbling something about checking on a patient in the step-down unit. His coffee wasn't even empty. She was alone in the break room with her burnt coffee and the hum of the refrigerator. Margaret set the mug down without drinking from it. She'd seen plenty of ostracism in her career. It happened in military units when someone broke an unspoken code, and it happened in hospitals with the same ruthless efficiency. The rule was simple: if you challenged authority, authority found ways to make you invisible. No one spoke directly. No one confronted. They simply evaporated whenever you entered a room, like smoke responding to a current of air. What they didn't know was that Margaret had trained in units where ostracism was a survival mechanism. Where a medic who talked too much got people killed. Where silence wasn't weakness, it was operational security. She left the coffee untouched. The transfer order arrived at 0800 hours the next morning. Dr. Ashford handed it to her personally in his office on the administrative floor, a move calculated for maximum public humiliation. His office smelled like expensive cologne and the kind of air that had been recirculated through a building too many times. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the hospital's east parking lot, where Margaret could see her 10-year-old Subaru, the engine ticking as it cooled from her pre-dawn drive. Pediatric wing, Ashford said, his voice steady and smooth as polished marble. Effective immediately. Your recent trauma during the security incident has clearly compromised your judgment. ICU work requires clarity. Stability. I'm sure you understand. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. His tie was crimson silk. His hands were soft, hands that had never resuscitated anyone, never compressed a chest, never felt a patient's last heartbeat under their palms. Margaret took the paper. Her name was on it. Her signature line was blank, waiting for her to acknowledge the transfer with a pen stroke. The document itself was remarkable in its cruelty, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. Your medical judgment is suspect. You're unstable. We're reassigning you to care for children because we cannot trust you with adults. The incident, Margaret said slowly, or my response to it. Your response, Ashford confirmed. He'd already turned back to his desk, already begun typing on his computer as though the conversation was finished. The dismissal was surgical. Precise. A technique she recognized from her own command experience, the art of destruction disguised as bureaucratic efficiency. She stood there for a measured breath. Then another. She could feel the tremor in her hands, but it wasn't fear. It was the specific kind of restraint that comes from having already survived worse. Her jaw tightened once. The muscle released. Strange, Margaret said, her voice dropping 2 full octaves, filling the office with a kind of quiet that belonged to someone who'd commanded under fire, how my judgment was fine for 3 years until I worked one specific case. She let the words hang there between them like coordinates on a map. The paper felt light in her hands, almost insubstantial for something designed to wreck a life. Ashford's fingers stopped moving across the keyboard. She watched his jaw work once, twice. He would not look at her. That will be all, Margaret. She walked out before he could say anything else, before he could escalate, before she gave him the satisfaction of seeing any break in her composure. The door closed behind her with the soft hiss of a hydraulic closer. The pediatric wing intake began at 1,400 hours. Margaret's locker in the ICU was already packed by 1,200, her personal items, 3 backup stethoscopes, a spare shift badge, the laminated patient care protocol she'd annotated by hand over 3 years, all of it fitting into one cardboard box that smelled like old coffee grounds and someone's lunch from several days ago. The faded unit patch she kept inside her jacket lining. The one that had survived Ramadi, that had been sewn into the fabric by James's mother with thread that had held for 6 years now, stayed with her. Some things did not go in boxes. The transfer orders arrived by courier at 17:30. Not email. Not a phone call. A delivery driver in a blue uniform holding a sealed manila envelope, the hospital's logo embossed in the corner. The routing was specific: Margaret Walsh, RN, reassigned to Riverside Rural Health Clinic, effective immediately. Riverside was 4 hours north, a facility with 43 beds, a surgical suite the size of a storage closet, and a patient population that couldn't afford the kind of care Seattle General provided. It was exile dressed up as job assignment. Dr. Ashford's signature was bold across the bottom. No date written, it didn't matter. The signature was the only thing that mattered. Margaret placed the envelope on her kitchen table and didn't open it again. She knew what it said. She could recite the language without reading it: reassignment due to performance concerns, pending psychiatric evaluation, final paycheck will be processed within 10 business days. The specific cruelty was in the timing. 3 years of perfect nursing. 0 complaints before this week. And now, all of it invalidated by one man's need to protect something he'd buried in his office files. She began packing her apartment with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done it before. Summer uniforms into one box. Winter into another. She didn't know how long she'd be at Riverside. She didn't know if Seattle General would even accept her if she appealed. Ashford had built a narrative in 48 hours that made her look unstable, reactive, a liability. What Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have known because Ashford had made certain the communication was encrypted and routed through personal phones, was that at that exact moment, 1847 hours, Ashford was in his office deleting security footage. Not from the night of the stabbing. Those files were already scrubbed clean, already fed through an algorithm that scattered them across dark servers he'd been maintaining since his opioid diversion scheme began 18 months ago. No, the footage being deleted now was from the past 72 hours. The ICU pharmacy after hours. His face, caught on camera at 0230, moving medication from the locked cabinet into a bag. The timestamp from the code blue, the moment when Margaret had run back into the ICU against direct orders, her hands moving on muscle memory, creating an emergency chest seal from MRE packaging she kept in her bag because old habits never truly died. The video that showed Ashford standing in the doorway while Margaret worked, his face gone pale, his hands trembling as he realized that the sergeant major's sealed military file wasn't just documenting a patient's medical history. It was documenting the federal investigation into opioid diversion. It was documenting him. He wiped the drive clean. Redundant backups. Off-site storage. Everything connected to that pneumothorax, that moment of crisis, that 3-minute window when the sergeant major's life had hung on the precision of Margaret's hands. The fluorescent lights in Ashford's office hummed as the files disappeared into nothing. He sat back in his expensive chair, in his office with the view of the parking lot, and allowed himself exactly 7 seconds of relief before his burner phone vibrated with a text from a number he deleted before reading it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was something Ashford couldn't see yet, something being set into motion by the simple act of an unconscious Marine Sergeant Major beginning to wake up in a hospital bed, his eyes flickering open in the darkness of the ICU, his first word a name that would change everything. The monitor's alarm pierced through the ICU at 11:33 p.m., a sound that cut through the fluorescent hum like a blade finding bone. Margaret was 3 floors down, alone in the locker room, folding scrubs that no longer belonged to her into a cardboard box marked personal items. The overhead intercom crackled, "Code blue, ICU bed 7. Code blue, ICU bed 7. Her hand stilled. She didn't breathe for 2 seconds. Then her muscle memory made the decision her mind was still processing. She was moving, dropping the box, running toward the stairwell before the intercom finished its announcement. The hallway blurred beneath her feet. Fire doors slammed open. Her badge was already confiscated, already a liability, but her body had memorized this route 3 years ago, and now it moved without permission, without protocol, without the slightest regard for the transfer orders sitting unsigned on her kitchen table. The ICU doors burst open and chaos met her like a physical force. The resident, a young man named Chen, competent enough but panicking, was frozen at the bedside, his hands hovering uselessly over the sergeant major's chest. The ventilator was screaming. The monitor showed nothing but a flat line with desperate spikes that meant his right lung had collapsed. Tension pneumothorax. A missed bleed from the surgical closure, blood pooling in the pleural space, compressing his heart until it couldn't pump anymore. 20 seconds and he'd be unsavable. Margaret didn't announce herself. She simply shouldered Chen aside, not roughly, just with the certainty of someone who'd done this 100 times before, and her mind became crystalline, surgical, perfect. Needle. 14 gauge. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her voice was different now. Not the deferential nurse who'd apologized to Dr. Ashford 2 hours earlier. This was the voice of someone giving orders that moved mountains. A nurse, an older woman named Patricia who'd worked ICU for 17 years, didn't question the command. She had the needle in Margaret's hand within 3 seconds. Margaret's left hand steadied the sergeant major's ribs, fingers finding the landmarks through muscle memory that lived deeper than thought, and her right hand moved with the terrifying precision of a surgeon who'd performed this procedure in blackened tents under mortar fire. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. Immediate. Violent. Perfect. The monitor shifted. Sinus rhythm flickering back like a candle finding wind. 72. 84. 92. She could feel the lung re-expanding beneath her palm, could sense the heart's rhythm stabilizing from a stumble into a gallop. 60 seconds. The sergeant major's color returned from gray to something approaching human. The oxygen saturation climbed, 68, 74, 88, 94. Steady. She'd done it in 90 seconds flat, the kind of time that only existed in textbooks and combat zones. Then the doors exploded open again and Dr. Ashford stood in the frame, his face the color of old concrete. "What are you doing?" His voice was sharp, panicked, something close to fear underneath it. Margaret didn't look up. She was checking for bleeding, for any sign that this wasn't just a pneumothorax but something deeper, something that would pull him back down. Tension pneumothorax. Missed bleed into the pleural space during closure. Her hands were already reaching for the chest tube setup, movements fluid as water, a surgeon's hands remembering things her mind had tried very hard to forget. "You have no authority here." Ashford's voice cracked on the last word. "You're fired. Security. Remove her immediately." The 2 guards appeared in the doorway like they'd been waiting for permission to exist. Margaret secured the chest tube with 4 precise stitches, tied it off, verified the breath sounds had returned to both lung fields, and only then did she step back and turn to face him. Her eyes were flat. Completely empty of anything resembling fear. "He's stable." She said it the way a soldier reports mission completion. No emotion. No apology. Just fact. The guards took her by the arms, not aggressively, they seemed uncertain, like they were handling something that might detonate, and she didn't resist. There was no point. Ashford was already talking into his radio, calling for the IT department, calling for records, his voice spiraling into the kind of panic that came from someone whose carefully constructed architecture was crumbling in real time. They walked her down the corridor with her belongings in a cardboard box, past the stairs of the night shift, past the open mouths of residents who'd just watched someone perform the kind of medical intervention that shouldn't have been possible outside an operating theater. They took her badge at the security desk. They watched her leave through the sliding doors at 11:58 p.m., 71 minutes after she'd walked into her apartment thinking she was done with all of this forever. The rain started before she reached her car, not gentle rain but the kind that hammered against the windshield like applause from an angry crowd. She drove for 20 minutes without destination, just moving, just breathing, until muscle memory carried her to the cemetery where they'd buried her husband 6 years ago. She stood at his headstone in the darkness, rain soaking through her scrubs, and her voice came out as barely a whisper against the storm. I tried, Danny. I tried to keep my head down like you said. Tried to build something normal. Something where I didn't have to be that person anymore. The rain hammered harder. She pressed her palm against the granite, cold and smooth and final. But I failed. I couldn't just watch someone die. I saw the monitor crash and something inside me just went. Like the 3 years didn't matter. Like I was still Reaper 6. Her hand, the left one, the one with shrapnel scars that had never fully healed, that would never fully heal, trembled against the stone. But this trembling wasn't fear. It was the aftershock of adrenaline meeting the weight of consequence. It was restraint finally released. He's a Marine, Danny. The Sergeant Major. And something about him, something about his file, something about Ashford's panic when I saved him, I think I just made myself into a target. I think I just changed something that was supposed to stay hidden. She stood there for 2 hours while the rain tried to wash her clean. It couldn't. Some things don't wash off. Some things live too deep in the muscle, too deep in the bone, to ever be completely erased. By the time she got home, there were 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize and a text message from an unknown sender. Check your email. Your termination letter. Read carefully. Pay attention to the date on the termination form. Then check your medical board notifications. She opened her laptop with hands that had steadied themselves through 100 field surgeries. The termination email from Human Resources was dated that morning, 6:27 a.m., before the crash, before the save, before she'd violated protocol one final time. But the medical board notification was dated that night, 11:52 p.m., just minutes after she'd been escorted from the building. Ashford was filing for her nursing license revocation. The charges listed were insubordination and unauthorized patient contact, but the real charge, the one that would end her ability to practice medicine anywhere in the country, was reckless endangerment of hospital protocols. He was moving fast. He was moving because he was scared. He was moving because somewhere in that classified file the Sergeant Major carried, there was something that connected to Ashford's stolen medications, his diverted opioids, his methodical corruption of a hospital system designed to save lives. And Margaret Walsh, the timid night shift nurse who was supposed to stay invisible, who was supposed to fade into the background like the thousands of other overqualified people hiding in scrubs, had just saved the witness he needed to stay unconscious and silent. The rain outside her apartment window continued its assault on the glass. Margaret sat in the darkness with her laptop glowing like a confession, and she understood with absolute clarity that running to that ICU hadn't been heroism. It had been the final move in a game she hadn't known she was playing. The termination letter arrived on day 3. Registered mail, signature required, Margaret's name on the envelope in typeface that made it official. She stood in her apartment kitchen at 0900 hours with the paper in her hands, reading the language that had been carefully constructed to make her unemployable, insubordination, unauthorized patient contact, breach of protocol. The words blurred, not from tears, she didn't cry anymore, hadn't since Ramadi, but from the clarity of what they meant. Ashford hadn't just fired her. He'd filed paperwork with the state medical board, a formal complaint citing concerns about her judgment, her instability, her fitness to practice. The board investigator would call within days. The hearing would follow weeks after. By the time she had a chance to defend herself, the evidence of his crimes would be buried so deep it would take months to excavate. She could hear him on the other side of this plan, making phone calls. The state board director was probably someone he'd golfed with. The medical licensing authority had friends. Ashford's voice would carry the weight of institutional authority, a concerned administrator protecting the public. A dedicated doctor worried about a traumatized former nurse who'd lost perspective, whose judgment had been compromised by her military history, whose actions in the ICU had bordered on dangerous. The narrative was already written. Margaret was just the character they'd cast as the problem. The second page of the termination letter outlined her severance, 2 weeks of pay, COBRA insurance for 18 months if she could afford the $1,847 monthly premium, a non-disparagement clause that meant she couldn't speak publicly about her firing without facing legal action. A gag order disguised as severance. She set the letter on the counter and moved back to packing, her hand steady, her breathing even. The apartment was already half empty, boxes stacked in the living room, the rural clinic transfer paperwork printed and waiting on her desk. For hours away from Raleigh. For hours away from Seattle General, from the Sergeant Major sleeping in the ICU, from Ashford's carefully constructed empire of lies. The knock came at 1,400 hours, sharp and authoritative. Margaret opened the door to find a woman in her late 40s standing in full attention despite wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a blue blazer, boots polished to a mirror shine. The woman's eyes were the grey blue of someone who'd seen things, and her posture was the posture of someone who didn't take disrespect lightly. Her jaw clenched when she saw Margaret, as if recognizing something that had been missing. "Major Walsh," the woman said. "Not a question. A statement of fact. My father woke up an hour ago and identified you by your call sign. He's been asking for Reaper 6. Margaret's hands went still. Reaper 6. The call sign from Ramadi, from the field hospital under siege, from the 18 months she'd spent keeping people alive while everything around them burned. A call sign she hadn't spoken aloud in 7 years. "Your father is the Sergeant Major." "Yes. And he told me everything. Not the version you've been living here. The version from the classified files. The version that explains why Dr. Ashford has been so interested in destroying your career." The woman's eyes dropped to Margaret's left hand, the tremor visible in her fingers. "Permission to speak freely." "Stand down," Margaret said quietly. "Please." They drove to Seattle General in silence, the Sergeant Major's daughter keeping her eyes on the road while Margaret sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap. No questions. No accusations. Just a Marine who recognized another Marine and understood that explanations could wait. The parking lot looked smaller than it had 3 days ago, or maybe Margaret had simply grown larger, the weight of the termination letter pressing against her chest like a sandbag. The ICU doors opened to a room Margaret hadn't expected. The Sergeant Major was conscious, his color restored, his eyes alert. And standing around his bed like guardians were 4 Marine officers in dress blues, their uniforms so crisp they could cut glass. The Sergeant Major's hands trembled as he reached for a folder on his bedside table, a folder Margaret recognized. Classified. Stamped with watermarks that belonged only to specific intelligence agencies. Ashford stood at the foot of the bed, his expression still wearing the mask of authority. Until the Sergeant Major began to read. Major Margaret Walsh, the Sergeant Major's voice was rough from intubation, but it carried the weight of testimony. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused, his eyes finding Margaret's. Purple Heart. Another pause. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. His hand shook harder. The surgeon who held the field hospital in Ramadi for 16 hours under siege. You kept 43 people alive. 43. The folder trembled. While your left hand was being reconstructed by shrapnel. Ashford's face went pale. The mask slipped. For the first time, Margaret saw something in his expression that looked like fear, a genuine, cold, animal fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but one of the Marine officers stepped forward. A lieutenant colonel with the bearing of someone used to being obeyed. "Dr. Ashford, we're becoming very interested in why you've been so invested in discrediting Major Walsh's nursing record." The officer's voice was quiet. Clinical. Particularly given the pharmaceutical anomalies we've been documenting in your ICU pharmacy for the past 8 months. That's when the hospital IT director walked in. Chen. Margaret remembered him from orientation, a Navy veteran, quiet guy, worked nights in the basement server room. He carried a hard drive and a laptop, and his expression suggested he was about to burn down the building. "We've been tracking pharmacy access," Chen said, connecting the laptop to the wall display. "Your key card, Dr. Ashford. 12 visits to the fentanyl cabinet at times when no patients required pain management adjustments. The screen flickered to life, showing timestamp footage. 0300 hours. Ashford's card entering. His hands filling his pockets. Vials disappearing from the inventory system like water through sand. The sergeant major had been investigating a pill mill operation that stretched across 3 hospitals. Ashford's name had come up. When the sergeant major was admitted 3 weeks ago and documented Margaret's half-conscious words about Fallujah and the major, Ashford understood immediately that his secret was walking upright on her next shift. Isolation was the strategy. Make her unemployable. Destroy her credibility. Bury the evidence before she could connect the pieces. Federal agents were in the hallway. Margaret could see them through the window, badges on belts, the kind of quiet authority that came from working cases that mattered. The lead agent stepped forward, and Ashford's composure finally broke entirely, not the measured collapse of a tactical retreat, but the splintering of someone whose world had shifted on its axis. Dr. Richard Ashford, you're under arrest for theft of controlled substances, obstruction of a federal investigation, and witness tampering. The agent recited the Miranda rights while Ashford's mouth moved without sound. Strategic competence meant nothing now. Criminal conspiracy ended with handcuffs. As they led him from the ICU, Ashford turned toward Margaret with something like bewilderment on his face, as if he still couldn't comprehend how a quiet night shift nurse had become the architect of his downfall. The answer was simple. She hadn't. She'd just gone back to work when someone needed saving, and the truth had followed like blood in water. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the Director of Emergency Medicine office at Seattle General, the corner view overlooking Raleigh stretching to the horizon. The faded unit patch from Ramadi hung framed on her wall beside her Purple Heart, the jacket lining preserved under museum glass. 2 inches by 4 inches of fabric that had cost her a career, then gotten her one back. The position had come with a caveat: mandatory cultural training for all administrators, taught by veterans who understood the weight of hidden strength. Margaret had spent the first month dismantling Ashford's structure, the policies designed to isolate, the protocols that prioritized liability over care, the culture of intimidation disguised as management. She'd replaced it with something dangerous, a hospital that actually trusted its staff to make decisions in crisis. The sergeant major visited monthly, his recovery complete, his investigation still generating arrests. 17 arrests across 3 hospital systems. 17 doctors, administrators, pharmacy technicians who'd been diverting controlled substances while patients suffered. The quiet war that nobody saw until someone looked close enough. Through her office window, Margaret could see across the parking lot to the county hospital. Ashford worked night security there now, checking IDs, watching faces, probably thinking about the moment when a woman he deemed too damaged to trust had turned out to be exactly the person who couldn't be broken. She adjusted the unit patch on her wall, her trembling fingers steady for just a moment, and returned to the stack of veteran nursing school applications on her desk. She wrote on the first file, the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Let's make sure they never have to hide it. Then she signed her name, Margaret Walsh, Major, retired, and understood that this was what victory looked like. Not applause. Not recognition. Just a quiet woman in an office, using her authority to protect the people nobody else could save. If you've been underestimated before, if you've ever held strength that nobody recognized, subscribe and hit that notification bell because these stories need to be told. Comment below, would you have trusted yourself to step back into that ICU?